Hello, everybody. This is Carol Kauffman, and I'm delighted that today Margaret Moore and I will be sharing with you about positive psychology, particularly from the perspective of how you would talk about it with a client or be informed in what you do by a client. So first I'll introduce Margaret, and the Institute exists because of Margaret, because many years ago she turned to me and said, Carol, coaching needs an academic home and you have to provide it. To which I said, no. A number of times later, finally I said yes, and the Institute was born. So Margaret, as you know, I'm incredibly grateful for you for being the driver of this and your belief that this kind of organization could really be a game changer. So everyone, that's a bit of what Margaret has been in my life. What she also is the CEO of Well Coaches, where she trains about 1,000 coaches a year. And she does this on a very strong evidence basis as she does her own coaching. As we go through, Margaret will be presenting positive psychology and coaching. She is going to be the melody. I will be the harmony, where I'll make comments here and there. And my comments will be more around leadership coaching and 360 feedback. Margaret?
Well, thank you, Carol, and I'm glad for the gratitude, given that this is the topic is positivity, and of course gratitude is one of the top-ranked positive emotions. And I also want to express my gratitude. Carol was my host in the early days of many positive psychology conferences back in the days when some of you may have been there, when Gallup was the host, and we were in the beautiful Gallup building in Washington, D.C. And it was through those many years of exposure and meeting all the key players that I fell in love with positive psychology, and it has become a central piece, not alone, but a central piece in my work, and it's all because of Carol, because in fact, Carol, you started off more as a positive psychologist even than a coach, and inspired me greatly. And I want to acknowledge Carol, because Carol is, as you know, the executive director of the Institute of Coaching, and has really carried the major load in getting us off the ground, raising the first $2 million, which has financed us up until now, including giving out coaching research grants, and is the reason we're all here today. And I believe, Stephanie, you've got a few housekeeping comments. I wonder whether we lost Stephanie. Maybe not. Okay.
I am here.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
I noticed a couple of.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you. Sorry, I noticed one or two participants could not hear the audio, so I was trying to help them out for a moment.
Okay.
Actually, this is a great time to pause, and if people are familiar with the raising of the hand function, if you could please raise your hand if you can hear me, just to confirm that audio is working, that would be terrific. Okay, great. Okay, I have most hands coming up. Wonderful. So thank you, Margaret, for passing it over to me. Like Margaret mentioned, I just have a few housekeeping details. We do welcome your questions fully during this webinar, so please feel free to send them to us via the webinar question function, and Margaret and Carol will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the session. All attendee audio has been muted to avoid background noise. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available online within a week. So if you'd like to listen to it again, or if you know any other members who weren't able to join, please suggest that they listen to it. As a reminder, all teleclass and webinar recordings are located in the podcast section of the library on the ICPA website. Finally, there will be a survey following this webinar, and we would appreciate it if everyone would complete the survey. You will need to complete the survey if you wish to receive any CEUs. And now back to you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. So I'm looking at my screen here. I hope you can all see the first slide, and as Carol mentioned, I'm going to do the melody, and she's going to jump in with the harmony and some additional points. We're not actually. Can we do a poll, Stephanie?
Yes, we sure can, Margaret.
So let's ask the question. If you are very familiar with positive psychology, which means that you've read a lot of papers, maybe been to conferences, read a number of books, put your hand up now so we can get a sense for how many people are new to this topic and how many people are not.
So Margaret, we have about a third of the attendees with their hand up.
Okay, so then for many of you this is a new topic. Well, then we're delighted to be here, and to those who know the subject well, I hope you can bear with us if we are repeating things that you have learned long ago. So I'm going to start with the biology because I am a biologist, and so let's just talk about the genetics of positivity and the level of positivity that one has in one's life. And like just about every human physiological system and trait, there is a biological basis, and it's around 50% for most, and that's not different here in that the level of optimism and positive emotions that you carry with you every day has a biological basis, which is about half, and then about 40% is related to your own efforts to improve your mood and your level of positivity. And interestingly, only about 10% relate to your circumstances, where you're born, who your parents were, and all those good things. So that means that we do have the ability to influence the level of positivity in our lives. Now,
Margaret, let me pop up for 1 second, which is also what's very important to remember is this graph is accurate in terms of life circumstances if you are above the poverty level. If you are below the poverty level, it can go either way. Robert Biswas-Diener has done a lot of work looking at well-being in extremely poor situations, but in others, that's an important reminder.
Great. So on to sort of the basic biology then of positive and negative emotions. So many of you may know this. We've got Dan Goleman coming back this year with his latest in the emotional intelligence field, and we've all been learning that negative emotions, while they have their biological function, which is an important one, they are the signals of whether our needs are being met or not. They also have dramatic impacts on our physiology. They are designed to move lightning fast. They stick like Velcro. And if the dose is too high, they in fact hijack our brain's resources. And they do this because the brain wants to avoid danger. We want to avoid crises, and we also want to solve problems. So the brain gets stuck on problems. Many of you may have experienced a little bit of rumination from time to time. On the other hand, positive emotions have a very different biological feel. They are not like Velcro, and they don't move as quickly. They're more like butterflies. They're fleeting, and they disappear like Teflon very quickly. They're worth hanging on to, though, because they do improve our brain function. They make us more open-minded and more creative, and they're vital to a good coaching session. And so the two are very different, and they're both good in the right dose. I was reminded this weekend I had a mini crisis, and which was a huge dose of negativity. And of course, I piled in and got something done and went much deeper than I would have if I've just been in a positive mindset. And it reminded me that a crisis, once in a while, a lot of negativity, can be very helpful for human change and human accomplishment. However, too much of it that's chronic can really be depleting. So actually, I think I'll skip this slide. Carol, do you want to add anything else on negativity at this point?
No, I'll skip negativity. Thank you.
Okay,
This
so
time.
we'll stay on the positivity. And actually, that's an interesting point because there is a somewhat of a backlash on. I hear this from people more and more around positive psychology because there's been so much emphasis on positive emotions in that field to the exclusion of dealing with negative emotions. And we're not here to tell you that negative emotions don't matter and that we don't need interventions. And in fact, at this year's conference, we have Steve Hayes with us, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, which is being applied to coaching, which is a nice model for handling negative emotions. But that's not where we're going to be today.
Right. Well, actually, that's not where you're going to be. What I'm going to do later is when we get moving on in coaching, I'm going to really focus on the 1 in the 3-to-1 and really talk about confrontation and how we really balance that out in the coaching.
Wonderful. Great. So there was a pivotal paper in 2005. It was a meta-analysis looking at 250 studies and the impact of frequent positive affect. And the bottom line is that people with a high level of positive affect have more success in life, relationships, finances, and health. And so it's this really speaks to the fact that we can all do more and benefit more from increasing our levels of positivity. Now, when we think about the brain, this is where positivity can make a huge difference. I mean, you just think about a given day when you start out and things go well. It really can lead you to be more productive and creative. Whereas if the car runs out of gas and the coffee machine breaks and you start off on the wrong foot, it makes it more difficult to do one's best work. So positive emotions do light up the prefrontal cortex. They make us more open-minded, more flexible, more creative, more adaptable. We are more agile. We can get to the big picture. We can see peripheral vision. So one of the tenets that I teach coaches is to start off a coaching session by generating positivity so that when you get to the tough, more challenging things, then there is in fact enough juice, enough flexibility, creativity, etc. in order to handle the more challenging parts of a coaching conversation. So positive emotions not only work in the moment by improving our brain function, they accumulate over time. So over time, we build resources. We get better at learning and problem solving. We get better at making relationships. We become more resilient and optimistic. We even get more coordinated, which of course is good if you've got if you're a tennis player. Now this paper is one that I often share with my executive clients because if you've got a client who's concerned that, gosh, positivity is a bit too much fluff and there really are, this is a brutal world out there and I'd really like to get on to something serious, this paper I think is pivotal because Barbara Fredrickson made the case with some pretty fancy mathematical algorithms that the mechanism of action of resilience starts with the level of positive emotions. So basically, if you look at what increases life satisfaction, you wonder, is it emotions, positive emotions, or resilience? Vice versa, if you have resilience and life satisfaction, do you have more positivity? Well, it turns out that the way you get to resilience is through life satisfaction, in that you are more satisfied with your life. The way you get to life satisfaction is through more positive emotions. And another way to put that is that the way we feel good about ourselves and our lives is because we bounce back. We can bounce back from adversity. And bouncing back from adversity requires enough positivity, which means that if you're going to live a life with a lot of adversity and a lot of challenge, like most of us have, you need a sufficient dose of positive emotions in order to be able to do that. And back to the biology. In the last few years, more recently, we've begun to see connections between positive emotions and negative emotions and biology. So for instance, we now know that negative emotions impair gene expression of the immune system, making you more prone to colds and flu and probably more serious autoimmune diseases. Positive emotions improve vagal tone. That's the parasympathetic nervous system, basically the part of our nervous system that's responsible for relax and recover, and also our endocrine system. We now know that people with high levels of chronic positive emotions live longer and suffer less with chronic disease. And if you've got symptoms of a chronic disease, those symptoms will be reduced by positive emotions. So in fact, positive emotions not only improve our cognitive function and resources, psychological resources, they improve our physical resources, which means now you're starting to see conversations around positivity ratios and measures in medicine as a medical intervention. Now, in Barbara Fredrickson's latest work, she has shown that positive emotions have their mechanism of improving health via sharing them with others. So basically, when you share your good feelings and good experiences with another human being, like you would with a coach, that improves the vagal tone, the nervous system aspect that has to do with recovery and relaxation. And so just simply feeling good by yourself doesn't have the same health impact. And this then speaks to the fact that positive emotions then in relationships, in particular coaching relationships, could even be seen as a health intervention. So it's a two-way street. When you have good health, you have more positive emotions. When you have positive emotions, you generate positive health. And so the positivity ratio at positiveratio.com is an excellent assessment. I often have my clients complete this ratio. It takes a couple of minutes. You need to do it a few times to get an average. And while, in fact, if you've been following the positivity literature, there has been a lot of discussion around the mathematical basis of this ratio, and all of the math is being questioned. And I'm not going to go into that today unless anyone wants to explore it further. But suffice to say that the better your ratio, you know, if you've got 3, 4, 5 positives to 1 negative, you're likely going to get the benefits, both brain and health benefits from positivity. And 80% of people are below that level, below the level of 3 to 1, which means that they may not have the cognitive resources to change. They may be struggling to make the changes we want them to work on as coaches without an adequate dose of positivity. Carol, do you want to add anything?
Margaret, yeah, I want to make just one comment because there's been such you guys may not know it, but there's been this real thing about, is this all true because these fancy ratios are wrong? And the simple thing I want to say is, in case if you guys ever have someone go, hey, I heard that's not true anymore, that what it is the really, really fancy sort of, they call it non-parametric, blah-de-blah, butterfly attractor, all that. That's what's being questioned. The simple math is not being questioned, and that is just extraordinarily clear in many different studies when you look at what people say, what they do, what they write, if you listen to them talk. In all of those studies, again, this either 5 to 1 or 3 to 1 ratio in order to get greater creativity and business performance also is really, that is pretty rock solid. So I just want to share that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that reminds me that Gottman's work in marriages has shown independently that you need a ratio of 5 to 1 for a marriage to be successful. So that's worth thinking about, because that means you want to have at least 5 good thoughts about your spouse for every 1 negative one. And that's no small feat. I'm sure most of you would agree. So the model that I want to tell you a little bit about, and I'm going to go through this really quickly, that I use with my clients and teaching coaches is just, there's so many ways to come at positivity in terms of, you know, what kinds of positivity are better than others. You know, we're beginning to see that purpose and meaning may may rank higher in terms of impact on health and mental well-being. Relationships rank high. So there's lots of ways to shuffle this deck. What I want to do is just give you one framework to think about, which is to think about positivity relative to the past, the present, and future, because I find it a simple way of thinking about this. And I have a little score that you can take away on basically 10 different sources of positivity. 3 relate to the past, 5 relate to the present, and 2 relate to the future. So the past, so this is where gratitude comes in, because one can look back at the past and focus on the lessons you've learned and be grateful for those. When things don't go well, you can recognize quickly that typically when a door closes, another one opens. To the extent that you can forgive and let go, that's extraordinarily helpful. We do, even when we are in the present and totally mindful in the present, I think we do still carry around the past and the future with us, a bit like clouds on a sunny day. If you're plagued by concerns about your past, those clouds follow you around. Similarly, around the future. So it's worth paying attention whether you help people refer to a therapist or to get help with the old stuff. Gratitude.
So Margaret, this is where I'd like to jump in.
Sure.
Some of the work I do is I'm involved in some of these really large-scale leadership development programs that get rolled out in the top 100 or in the top 500 people in an organization. And we really help people look at the dark side of the past as well. In particular, as part of the authentic leadership model that we work on that's connected to Harvard Business School, one really important piece is what we call crucibles, which is really looking at the past for the hardest experiences of your life and not diving into them saying things like, oh gosh, it really wasn't that bad, or I'll just remember the positive. What we do is we have them really dive into the experience and remember what happened. And what you do is you dive in, and then you all can use this when you're with a client, a leader, or anyone who is describing a really terrible situation, which is to then really say, so what can you learn from this? After you really join them in your empathic and, shoot yourself before you say, and let's think of the positive, but really to then say, what can you learn from this? What is the meaning? Or if they're talking about the past, to really say, what did you get from this? And if they really don't sound like they really got something from it. I had one client who was, CEO in a law firm, thrown out of power, all these terrible things happened, and I said, so, what did you learn from that? And she said, well, I really learned that, good things can happen after all. To which I said, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. And she was shocked at that. But I really wanted to push, what did you really learn? She was mamby-pamby another time, and then finally I said, what did you learn? And she just snapped at me and said, Carol, I learned I have a backbone of steel. In which case I went, yes. The lesson should equal the intensity of the crucible, and how to really help our people do that, which doesn't sound like what people think of right away with positivity, but it can really be useful because you don't go into the crucible for healing. You go into the crucible for your leadership and what you can bring from that leadership to the present.
Excellent. Thank you. So gratitude, if you don't know Robert Emmons, he is really putting the science of gratitude on the map. For leaders, it's very important to remember to express gratitude. That's one thing we often drive by and forget to do. It's very easy to do that, and people are obviously very appreciative of recognition and appreciation, more so than maybe we may appreciate. So gratitude is an intervention that helps you be resilient in tough times. It strengthens bonds. it keeps us from getting bored and adapting and taking things for granted. So that might be something you want to dig into. Now then,
and Margaret, I'd like to make a comment on that as well. A wonderful intervention I use a lot with the leaders is like, when do you need to step into gratitude in kind of an emergency way, on the fly, when you're leading people? And one of the ways to do that is, say someone has done something which just has you livid. As we all know, these leaders are under such stress, they occasionally, frequently, get livid at people. And one thing I encourage them to do, and I sort of adapted this from Sonia Lubomirsky's work, which is, there you are, you're looking at the person, and what you want to do is, first of all, yell at them, and you know you can't do that, but you have to say something or adjust your attitude. Now, what you can do is imagine the following. Imagine a blank piece of paper, and there's a circle in the middle, and there is the person that you are really mad at or feel very disappointed by, and that's your whole experience of them in that moment. So the circle in the middle says what they just did wrong. And again, you don't talk yourself out of it. You don't say it wasn't so bad. What you do instead, literally or in your mind, is you draw 8 other circles. And you ask yourself, what has this person also done that I am grateful for? And then you remember what they've done, and you can reverse the focus back to the thing that you're grateful for. So I just want to point out that gratitude can feel very airy-fairy, or, you know, gee, I'm just so grateful, and that is terribly important, but it also is a very good secret weapon for leaders to try to help themselves get back to an equilibrium when they are upset by one of their leaders or one of their team members.
Yeah, that's excellent, Carol. And that reminds me, I think you might do this too. Back to marriages, a great before bedtime ritual is for each spouse to share what they're grateful, 3 things they're grateful for that day that they contributed to. And Carol, I often tell the story of when you had your terrible day around your book. Do you mind if I tell it, or do you want to tell it?
Okay. You can tell it, and I'll correct you how you're incorrect.
Okay. Well, you know, it's not going to sound the same. But I do report Carol's story because I remember, Carol, you had a bad day where a book that you've been working on blew up. That's no small deal when you're writing a book, as some of you will appreciate.
Yeah.
And
it was much worse than that. We discovered that my agent had stolen the book and had started representing my co-writer instead of me. It was quite
oh my
betrayal.
gosh, so it was theft, yes. So and
oh yeah, you know,
your son
2 years down the drain.
Was he 8 years old at that time, and he'd been home from school, off school, sick, and you'd sat outside in the sunshine and had this delicious intellectual conversation with him that was the first time you'd had an adult-like conversation. And when you did the 3 things I'm grateful at the end of the day, that came to mind, and you realized if you hadn't done the exercise, it would have gotten lost.
That's right. And how often do we lose the most precious memories of our lives because we let the negative that's Velcro stick to it? It was like a near car accident when I'm like, I don't even remember my day. You know, all I remember is I just lost a couple $100,000 forever. And then I'm like, what did I do? And then suddenly I remembered it and was like, oh my goodness, I would never have remembered this. It was very, very powerful moment for me. And the book thing never did get recovered. No happy ending. Just my learning.
But I always think about your son when I think about that story.
Me too.
So it's wonderful. Okay, so now we've dealt with the past. We'll go to the present. And there are a lot of things that we can do in the present to generate positivity. First is to spend, I don't think I have slides on this, spend, you know, small moments savoring small pleasures, a decent cup of coffee, a quick conversation with a colleague, being present, experiencing, taking in what's around you. I'm going to leave Carol to talk about reverse the focus because that's one of your favorites. Being engaged in something you love, being in flow, and having a strong sense of meaning and purpose. The vast majority of adults have very little of that in a day, in a week, in a month, and it is probably the most energizing source of positivity when we are doing something that's worthwhile for a higher purpose. And if we can help our clients insist on carving out that time every day, that in itself is an enormous well-being intervention. Now, if you have not seen this movie, it's by National Geographic's DeWitt Jones, called Celebrate What's Right with the World, and it costs about $800 to buy the rights. But if you're doing talks and presentations on positivity, this is a brilliant video that I'd like to refer you to, and there's just no cheap way to get it, but it's well worth it. It is moving, and it's a great kickoff for any kind of event. We know that mindfulness has a way of generating positivity, and the way I describe it is that when you create the space where you step back from your negative emotions, it's like there's room for the positive emotions to bubble up. They're effervescent. You know, if you give them space, they'll come up. So when you move into a mindful place and you separate from your negativity, the positivity will just emerge. You don't have to go looking for it. Pleasures in the Present, one of my favorite books, which I still refer to from ages ago, Care of the Soul by Thomas Moore, not the old Thomas Moore. This is a more recent book. And this book really speaks to how to generate small pleasures every day. Carol, I'm going to turn this one over to you on Reverse the Focus.
Okay. Well, I think we've kind of done most of this already in a way, because my big Reverse the Focus story is the story of Michael, and how if I had not reversed the focus and gotten into a discipline of reversing the focus, I really would not have I just would have missed something important. And I really do this, I really try to do it every day, which means I do it every other day. I did it every day for a while, and like 4 years, but I slid. But it really helps. And I'm better now, but I used to be a terrible sleeper. And so at night, instead of thinking of all the things I didn't do or needed to do the next day, I just started scanning my day. And I'd go back, usually like in that horrible day, I'd go back, and typically I can't even remember the morning because each day feels about 3 days of activity. So I just think, what did I have for breakfast? And then I land on that. And then I scan through the day for nice experiences I had. And again, when I hit a negative one, instead of talking myself out of it, I just go, okay, I'm going to Teflon that for now and keep going. And it really does add to the reservoir. And it can, I found that it did just make, you know, in a way it's like how to have a happier life in no extra time, because you just look for what it is you've already experienced and kind of emphasize it.
That's great. And the thing I'd add to this has to do with the moments before you start into an important task. You know, whether it's for us as coaches, it's a coaching session. For our clients, it's stepping into a board meeting or a critical event of some kind. And this is where you want positivity on your mind, and it's usually not a good time to check your email and find something's gone wrong, which then hijacks you. It's not a good time to remember all of the things that are upsetting you at the moment. And if you can shift to a positive emotion, the brain, most of us can only focus on one thing at a time. Only 5% of us are true multitaskers that can do 2 things at once. So most of us can do only one, and so if we shift to the positive thought and the gratitude and the connection, whatever we choose, then the brain basically gets the immediate benefit from those positive emotions. So this is very valuable, this reversing the focus in the moment before you move into something mission critical. So that's invite a positive emotion. I think we can move, I guess it's worth mentioning, you know, this shifting to the positive mindset is a skill, it's a habit. And it's not that you're going to forget about the negative. You're still going to come back to it. It's not going to go away. But one does have to practice this. And so learning how to shift to a positive headset, especially for leaders whose moods obviously impact everyone around them in a team. And so it then becomes critical for leaders to know how to do this, to be able to just shift into the gratefulness, to the higher purpose, to the meaning of the moment, to the connection, because if they're sinking in stress, then everyone else is going to slip down that slippery slope as well. Now, the future. So the thing I really noticed when the recession hit, and it's interesting, Carol, that happened in 2008 at our first coaching conference, which is now 7 years ago. And
yes, and I'd like to comment on that. Is Ruth Ann Harnish is the person who gave us an award of $2 million to start the Institute of Coaching, and the day she was giving us the money was the day of the great drop, and she lost 3/4 of her fortune, which was ginormous, and she still gave the money that day. So I actually have very positive memories of that horrible day.
Right, and it really was that those 2 days, the markets were crashing around our ears. Now then, of course, what followed was, and still has lingered, a long period of reduced optimism. And what I realized, and there was increased depression and suicide and addictions everywhere. And what I realized is that perhaps among the most important sources of positivity are one's relationship to the future. And of course, if people are depressed, they really fundamentally are not excited or optimistic about the future. And that means that helping people build optimism and a future orientation is like another set of clouds that hang over our head when we're in the present. The past is with us and the future. So it becomes very important to develop the appropriate kinds of positivity in relation to one's future if you're going to have enough resources to get through today. So optimism is a phenomenon that has a biological basis. You might remember Marty Seligman's studies that looked at salespeople for a major life insurance company, and they discovered when they screened for the level of optimism that they picked better salespeople, because obviously salespeople are dealing with chronic rejection. They need to be more optimistic than others. So optimism is, I think, a trait, and there's opportunities to improve on it. Optimists see bad events as just temporary. So you stub your toe, you say, I stubbed my toe, no big deal. Whereas a pessimist sees a bad event as something with deeper, more long-lasting applicability. So you stub your toe and you say, oh, I'm so darn clumsy. So if you can reverse the focus here and reframe, how these bad events look to you, this can make a difference as well.
So Margaret, I'd like to pipe in here, and you can stay on this slide. I would like to just share for a moment how positive psychology can fit directly with the GROW model. And here it is, I see create a vision. So for those of you who may know, John Whitmore made it famous, although other people actually discovered it at first, is the GROW model of coaching is you ask questions around what is your goal, then what is the reality, what are your options, and what's the way forward. And when I was talking with John once, he said, it's actually, he was a little grumpy, and he's saying, I get so upset with the GROW thing. He goes, I really wanted to call it VRO, but that wouldn't sell, and the V is vision. And he really thinks that the first step in coaching is to really create a vision of yourself. What would you look like in this area if you were at your best? Or what is the real vision and intention you have? And then from there kind of go down to the goals. Then in reality, to really make sure it's a reasonable look at reality, the negative and the positive, to really sort of look at what's gone right for you, what will help your situation, what are the challenges you have to overcome. Then we get to the O, which is your options. And positive psychology research suggests that the most highly competent people can come up with 6 pathways forward. This is the work of C.R. Snyder, Rick Snyder, and others in something called Hope Therapy, which is also connected to Hope Coaching. But what it is it's just about people who are highly effective. And one of the things I do is we haven't mentioned Chris Peterson and the work on strengths. And we can talk about that a little later. There is a free measurement of strengths at authenticleadership.org. And it's really a measure of your different strengths. But in the O of grow, I'll often say and think about if what you need to do is on the other side of a chasm, what is the bridge that can get you there? And in particular, how can we look at the person's strengths and help them use a strength in a new way to cross the bridge? So for example, if you have to have an extremely highly conflictual feedback session with someone and tell them something really difficult, and you say, well, I'm terrible at bravery, and I just can't do that. But as you explore the strengths, the strength a person could have might be love of learning, which is also love of teaching. And then to say, well, how could you use your love of learning and teaching in a new way to help you with this difficult challenge? And that might be, oh, if I could really either describe in a teaching way how this behavior affects me or others, that would be a bit different from saying, you know, listen, blah, 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 you need to change. Because it goes to a teaching relationship because that's that person's strengths. So then the way forward can be based on which of the strengths or which couple of the strengths they'd like to use in a new way to cross over the bridge. So I just wanted to do that because I actually kind of like the GROW model. I think we shouldn't just stick to that. It should be integrated to a lot of other things, but it is a really nice and clear way to marry positivity in the GROW model.
Great. And so back to defining the positive future, and you know, there are lots of good reasons to do some kind of visualization or visioning process. This is really, and if you think about, most people in business are pretty future-oriented because we set goals and we are always, you know, developing strategic plans, and so planning and thinking about the future is not foreign to most people. But imagining the positive future and seeing yourself in it is a source of positivity because it gives you a sense that there's a reason for you to get up every day and that you've got something to offer and you've got something to contribute and you've got a future. And when people are unemployed and underemployed, this is really a tough area. So it's important to help people do this. And then you may know Tali Sharot's work on the optimism bias. She's a neuroscientist and has studied the prevalence of optimism and has concluded that humans are in fact irrationally optimistic. And of course, if you're entrepreneurial and a risk taker, you're even more so. And her thesis is that that's adaptive. Just like we're meaning makers, you know, we need to be asking questions and believing, having faith in forces larger than ourselves. And so this optimism is in fact a survival mechanism. We are the more optimistic we are, the more we flourish, the more successful that we are. And we also achieve more than if we're not optimistic. So when we set a goal to go to the moon and think, you know, I think I might just get there, we may not, but we're going to get a whole lot closer than if we had set a goal that's less ambitious. So that's an ode to the future. And with that, I had to cut. I've probably got 200 slides on positivity, and Carol, you probably got as many. And so we have only given you a quick tour today, and partly as a warm-up. So maybe now would be a good time to move to discussion for those of you to ask questions and for us to maybe get even deeper in some of these interesting topics.
I think Stephanie is in charge of our questions. Stephanie, can you unmute and let us know some of the questions people have asked?
So would you like me to unmute the full audience? And
sure, if it doesn't get too noisy, we can try it. So everyone, if there's noise in your background, mute your own phone so that we'll be able to open up the lines for everyone, which would be great. When you do speak, just say your name and where you're from, and then your question.
So Margaret and Carol, I think that there are maybe too many participants online.
Who haven't?
Oh.
Oops.
Margaret and Carol, are you?
Yep, we're here waiting for questions.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I can either read the questions out loud. I tried to unmute it, and it was we just have so many people on the line that the background noise is too heavy for this webinar.
Okay.
So I think it might be better. People are sending their questions in rapidly to me. So would you like me to forward those to you, Margaret, or read them aloud? Margaret?
Why don't you forward them to Margaret, but in the time it takes her to get them and this and that, why don't you read one out loud?
Okay. I think we're having a little bit of trouble hearing Margaret. Margaret?
You know, I heard the phone go mute, unmute, mute, unmute, so she may be accidentally muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, my phone,
yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry, I had the phone actually quit. Okay.
All right, you sound a little echoey, so if you're on speakerphone or something, get back to headset.
I'll do that. I'll switch back to the phone. There was some technical glitch.
Oops. So Stephanie, what's the question?
Great. The first question is, can you give an example of the language of starting a coaching session with positivity?
Well, interestingly, I have to say I usually don't. What I do is something from David Peterson. I begin almost every session with saying some version of, you know, how can I be of the most service to you right now? Because I think we don't brand the situation or the session as positive. What we do is we pull on it in the session. So as I described their first challenge, I might infuse it with positive psychology by saying, okay, well, what have you done that worked out well so far? You know, if the person is describing a challenge. But I won't begin with it because I think that, you know, if that's not where the person's at, you don't want to kind of brand it before they do. But I'll go to the strengths soon after.
Great. And I think Margaret's with us again. Are you, Margaret?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my phone quit. There are a few technical challenges. I want to just add, for those of you who are in the health and wellness sphere and might have shorter sessions, maybe even working in a medical office, when you've got a brief session, it might in fact be helpful to just ask, you know, what's going well for you right now, and kick off on a positive note. As Carol said, that doesn't always work, but there are places where it can really make a difference. When people come in expecting a focus on problems and instead you chat a little bit about what's going well, that can shift the energy a lot. And if people come in reporting all the things that didn't go well, sometimes I'll make it fun and say, okay, how about we just put that aside for a moment and just focus on what did go well, and make it an exercise to help them reframe quickly. So those are different other approaches.
Wonderful. And Margaret, would you like me to continue reading the questions, or do you?
Please.
Okay.
Please do.
Someone wrote in, very helpful and interesting presentation. I'm wondering if you have experience with coaching teams from a positive psychology perspective. So coaching teams.
Margaret, do you have a comment on that?
I don't have a lot of experience, except perhaps a little. I've had some coaching conversations around this. I would say that a good discipline, and I do this in my own efforts to lead teams, is to spend a deliberate amount of time going around the room, getting people to talk about what good thing that they want to report on, or what's good that's going on in their work life. So some measure, some way of generating some positivity early on, because the ratio of 3 or 5 to 1, whatever it happens to be, also works in groups, and so it becomes important to have enough positivity in the air. And I think, for me, I try to make it into a game, so that it doesn't feel forced. Just let's see if we can't, make sure we generate enough positive so that when we get to the negative, we can handle it. And then at the close of a meeting, to really take time to harvest and appreciate and be grateful, so you would land on a good note. So the opening and the closing and some balance of positive and negative throughout is something a leader can do and a coach can help them do.
Yeah, in coaching teams, and again, it's so interesting, the context, because Margaret and I coach in very different circumstances. If I tried to do like a game-like approach in most of my leadership teams that I coach, that would not go well. And when I've seen Margaret do it with her people, it goes extremely well. So one thing here that's very important for everybody is to make sure this isn't one size fits all, because I was just having a talk with someone today about picking coaches for a coaching panel, and I was asking her, the woman who was putting together the panel, what are some of the things she looks for? And what she says is a range. So it is important that you get the positive psychology comments, but then you really integrate them with your own ways of working, and don't become a positive psychology one-trick pony. Because this coach who did not make a panel, was the one issue was she always approached every situation like a cheerleader, and like, so what's right with this situation, and that was her full range. And she didn't have the one, which is really either confronting or taking in. But what I find that can really help with teams is using some of the different strengths assessments, and have them develop the language of strengths in the room, and help really be able to appreciate who the members are and what they can bring to the table, and how it's very different. The last part I'd like to comment on is I'm now teaching about 75 faculty from Mass General Hospital on coaching, because they're coaching now all of the internal medicine residents. One of the things we do is we have them do a short version of the values in action inventory of strengths. And one of the teaching methods is I'll ask someone what their top 3 strengths are. And then, now these faculty will know each other. We meet in small groups, and I'll say, so I imagine the way you lead your team is, and then I'll base that on the top 3 strengths, and everyone goes, oh my goodness, that's exactly right. Then we'll go to another person who has very different strengths, and we'll say, oh, now that's right. Then I make them do it themselves the 3rd time. But what's important and what comes out in terms of the different styles of team leadership is that everybody is a different flavor. So the person who's chocolate ice cream needs to be their best chocolate, and strawberry, strawberry, and not try to think that there's one kind of team leadership model or team leader's way of being that's best, but that everyone has to discover what their unique leadership is, either as the member of the team or the head of it, and then certainly as the coach of the team.
Carol, that reminds me of another thing. I have to say, it is, when you're dealing with executives who are really not on board with positive psychology, they may not take to it like a duck to water. But one thing I've done is to buy a whole team a copy of Barbara Fredrickson's book on positivity. and they share it with their spouses. And that actually has turned out to be immensely valuable because there's lots of science and biology behind it, and it doesn't feel like fluff. And so that's another approach. And then I found, like, a year later, they're all talking about positivity and thriving, and you know, they get it. So you might have to find a bit of a runway to get people interested and engaged in the topic. I used to use the resilience paper a fair amount too, because that I would make the point that it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. You know, if you're going to deal with the crap that's flying at you every day at the, you know, the velocity is coming at you, then you're going to need to have resources, and this is, you know, this is the latest in what we understand those resources should be.
I do find, though, I don't introduce it directly, but they wind up, I have yet to have a team not like it or resonate it. And with the MGH faculty, the only problem is I can't get them out of the room at the end of the seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, Stephanie.
Great. Some clients declare their vision and then are freaked out by it, immediately hijacked by doubts. I'm sure that's familiar to many of us. What interventions have worked well in this kind of scenario?
Margaret, would you talk about the whole confidence level?
Yeah, so I think that here's how I view this. I think that a vision is a source of positive emotions. It's a source of autonomous motivation. You know, if you were in our section on self-determination theory, you know, it's your own vision, no one else owns it. That's precious. And so that's part of the story. But if you know the literature on self-determination and motivational interviewing, there is a second equally important force to support change. One is the motivation that comes from within, and the vision heightens that. The other side is the confidence or competence. And you need to have both together, because if you're not confident, your motivation will go to sleep. You don't dream for things that you can't have because it's too painful. And so it becomes very important to translate that vision and that motivation into something, some small step that makes you think, okay, well, I mean, I can only do what I can do next week. What would be a step that would take me in that direction? So you've got to balance it with some confidence-building activity, which is that, you know, we're not trying to get to the moon tomorrow, but what would be one thing you could do next week or in the next month before I see you, again, whatever your time frame is, that would take you a small way. You don't have to think about the vision all the time. The vision is kind of like the sun shining in the sky. It's beckoning. It kind of gives you a direction to go. But it's, you know, obviously a lot of competence and capacity have to be built along the way. So it's a great point. You've got to have both.
You know, I'd like to quickly share another thing. The very first coaching exercise I ever did in my very first coaching workshop ever, which was with Ben Dean from Mentor Coach, they started out with this, what I now call coach by numbers, which is you pick an area of your life, and the first thing you do is that big vision. It's on a scale of 1 to 10, if money and blah, blah, blah were no object, what would you look like? So that's the big vision, which is typically, if it's not a little scary, you haven't really done the big vision. What you then ask is, so on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you now? And then you can change the topic to where you are now. Then the next step is they say, so let's say you're a 3. They say, what could you do over the next 2 months to get from a 3 to a 3.5? And sometimes that can help when someone has spooked themselves because their vision is too big, too non-attainable. And so you can break it down into small steps. And one thing I remember learning from Margaret is in the health coaching is that someone would say they'd want to do, and she would then ask, you know, how confident are you that you can do this? And if the person doesn't say 80%, she finds a new goal because you really want to set them up for success.
Right, and in the literature in the chronic disease world, if your confidence is below a 6 or so out of 10, generally you're not likely to be successful. So there's a sweet spot that's kind of in the flow place where you're stretched but you're not anxious. So the goal you set for yourself is engaging. You're not bored by it, but it doesn't lead to anxiety, and that sweet spot is very important.
Great. Shall we move to another question?
Yes, let's do that.
What one other model might be appropriate besides GROW if the need is more about developing a decision?
Oh, I think the GROW model is quite limited. I think, it's not one that you can follow. I would do an integrative model of whatever it is. I mean, first of all, for them to get clarity about what the decision is, for them to think about it in the context of the organization, and really try to, pull from their own wisdom. And also, I believe that in leadership coaching in particular, and possibly health coaching also, there is also room for our input. And, I don't think our own content input should be much above 10 or 20%. And as soon as we're done giving the input, we should ask, so where does that take you? But I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for the decision. I think we try to really pull from all our toolboxes. Is the person, where are they on the Myers-Briggs? Because someone who's a judger on the Myers-Briggs has a very different process than someone who is a P. I'll also ask the person, so when have you been able to make a decision in the past? What did you do? What could we build on? What's making this one hard? And just really kind of exploring the terrain, but then also really looking out for how is the person talking to themselves? What is going on in that inner conversation that might be making the decision even more difficult? For example, again, self-determination theory. Is this what you really want to do? I was once coached for 9 sessions on a website that I wanted to create and didn't get anywhere. And then another coach spoke to me. First question he asked was, do you really want to do this? At which point I went, no, I don't. So really making sure the person wants to do it, that it's intrinsic and not extrinsic. So that's a little bit of a scattershot answer, but I hope it's useful.
Let me add to that, for those of you who've seen Bob Keegan in action,
right.
Immunity to Change map, I have to say I have fallen in love with, and I certainly don't use it with every client, but it begs the question, what's the developmental issue here? What is it that I want to improve on? Is it, and what is behind the reason I'm having trouble with this decision? And what do different parts of me want here? I've got probably different agendas. And I find that in one session, you can get people through, what's really behind this, what's the development, what's the growth edge for me, where am I stuck? Why am I seeing it this way? Why would this decision make me stuck and others haven't? What am I doing to sabotage this? And quite quickly you can get at some underlying thing that was actually not conscious, some subconscious assumptions that weren't just at the surface. And so sometimes even a great coaching conversation may not spot that growth edge where you're kind of unconscious to what's blocking you. So I have to say that that's a really good diagnostic tool.
Yeah, I forgot about that, Margaret. That's great.
Great.
Other questions, Stephanie?
Yes. What have you seen in senior executives as perhaps the most pragmatic ways of shifting from negative to positive emotions?
Okay. Let me try to think. There's a number of things that come to my mind. The first one is, some of the more basic things that we've been saying in terms of, well, what did you do right? What did that person do right? Another one is to really explore with them what energizes you. you don't necessarily use the word well-being or anything, but like, let's go through your day and see what really energizes you. And I guess in short, that's one of the things. Others, I'd have to have like a case in my head to remember what else I do. But often it's just kind of tweaking them to remember their, say, their peak leadership experiences. When did you do really well? And in that, I think I'm repeating myself. The other thing that is a stealth positive psychology technique is really just through your voice tone. So you could say, so what else happened today? Or you could say, so what else happened today? And it's really through kind of the emotion and interest that you emanate, not just, you know, sort of the content. And I find that makes a big difference, that through your voice tone and the way you are, you kind of emanate an energy that they can kind of click into.
Let me add that I think the positivity ratio can be really helpful because people are usually curious to know what their ratio is. And if a client is in a negative downward spiral, it will show up in the ratio, and they discover it for themselves. I remember doing a workshop in a big governmental agency, and a couple of people came up to me because I'd asked them to do the ratio before the workshop and said to me, you know, my ratio is like 1.8. You know, do you think that's right? And, you know, they were really curious. You know, am I really that negative? And then that opens the conversation to say, well, what is your inner world like? You know, because a lot of people are around the 2-to-1 ratio, which means that you're not doing as well as you could. And a little extra, I mean, one thing Barbara Fredrickson has taught us is that you don't need to change your career and your husband and wife and kids in order to up your ratio. It's often just the simple things we've been talking about, which is just to turn things around, to reframe things, to see the positive that's already right in front of you. So I think the ratio can be a pretty quick tool to get people conscious of, you know, well, how positive am I? And am I really, and in my marriage, you know, am I leading with my kids? Am I leading with the positive? You know, what went well first? I know parents around the dinner table who will have their kids talk about what went well as a discipline. In Vancouver, there is a group called the What's Going Well group who meet once a month just to explore what's going well, because so often we don't stop and think about that.
So Stephanie, how about another question?
Sure. And Margaret, just being aware of the time, we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we still have a handful of questions. Is there a best way for our participants today to contact us with their questions that were unanswered, perhaps by emailing me or you or Margaret?
Whoops, Stephanie, we cannot hear you at all.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Questions to Margaret. Margaret, do you want to give your email address?
Yeah, Margaret@instituteofcoaching.org.
Okay. Oh, and in the meantime, I want to tell a story because one of my favorite things to do, and that I have to do a lot, is to give feedback on killer 360s. And how do you do that? How do you bring positivity when you are being paid to bring out a baseball bat and confront people? And that was my job when I was doing coaching at Unilever. We actually went through the top 700 in 4 or 5 years. And that's where I actually found that people get the 360s, and there's a page of strengths. These are interview-based 360s, by the way, and they just gloss over them. So one thing you do is you just say, well, listen, I'm not going to let you talk about any of your development points until you really pull what you need to from the positive, because that's really hard to articulate. And, okay, I'll do that. Then I remember one woman, I call her Frida the CFO. She's not the CFO, but very interesting. She got feedback that literally said that her people would rather vomit than work with her. She was rude. She was high-handed, terrible followership. So I had this, and she came in. I talked with her. I had 1 hour to do this. And it was clear when I met her she was very narcissistically fragile, that, you know, if I just really gave her a negative piece of feedback, that she would either fragment or scream. So I spent literally the first 50 minutes of my 60 minutes establishing a relationship with her, where we kind of went to her strengths and, you know, we explored her relationships and formed a bond, because you can't confront if you don't care and if you don't have a trusting relationship. And it was really very interesting. So finally at 50 minutes, I thought, okay, we've got something here. Now, how do I say people would rather vomit than work with you? She also had a report. She knew what it said. So what my positive intervention was to say, so listen, Frida, I've just spent 50 minutes with you, and you are extremely warm. You are kind-hearted. Clearly you can relate, because we actually have a relationship after only 50 minutes. So I have to ask you, what is going on that your people would rather vomit than work with you? And from that place, she was actually really able to describe how she would scream to the secretary because she didn't have time to leave her office because so many meetings, and this and that, and it really became her difficulties managing stress. But if I hadn't really gone to the positive first, I wouldn't have been able to confront. And again, the positive is not just through emotion, but also through meaning, sense of purpose, and a bunch of possible ways. But I wanted to tell that story because, again, it's kind of the non-typical positive psychology intervention. Margaret, have you been able to receive any?
Yeah, I'm looking. I'm actually
questions?
Just going through all the questions because there are quite
Fabulous.
a few that we've not covered, and let me just look at the time. So I think there are a few here, and I'm wondering maybe we can put them in our newsletter that are that can wait. We will provide the slides. I see that's here.
Is there a content one that we?
Yeah, there was
that's
one.
of a
I'm
different,
just flipping through them.
Okay, one that's maybe on a slightly different slant.
How do you create a breakthrough with a client who seems chronically pessimistic and convinced that his circumstances validate his point of view?
You can take that one, Margaret.
I was going to give that one to you. Well,
actually, one thing you do is, depending on who the person is, to really point out what are the strengths in the pessimism. Like, unpack the pessimism in terms of how much of it is a really good analysis of the situation, how much of it is based on experience. And then you start out, I think, by just seeing, can the person be a little bit skeptical of their pessimism? Because, again, back to our very first slide, we all have this set point for happiness, and it just could be 50%. And here I love what Marty Seligman talks about it, because he says that he's a pessimistic, grumpy guy. And here's where we move to the different avenues, because you can be pessimistic and have no sense of purpose or meaning or being engaged in what you're doing. So for the pessimist, you might go for trying to help them get engaged in what they're doing. Again, be a little skeptical of the pessimism, see the positive attributes in the pessimism. Sometimes the pessimism is needed in the organization because other people are overly optimistic, and without the pessimist giving them some realism, they will go off kilter. And if other people could then become more reality-based, this person won't have to be pessimistic. And so I would say that's some of what you might do, but help them to get engaged and find a sense of meaning, because they're probably not going to be naturally happy campers.
and I know we're about to close, and I'm gonna add one remark to this, because there's another question about what are the benefits of pessimism for some particular tasks and jobs, like letters.
Oh. Yeah,
And
you bet.
my husband is a lawyer, and when we first started talking about positive psychology, he was a chronic pessimist. And we spent, a lot of time talking about the value of positive emotions, and it got to the point where he began to tell me when I was being pessimistic. And the shift was really understanding the science of the value of positive emotions, which takes me back to referring everyone to Barbara Fredrickson's books and her papers, because if you look at the data, if people are data-driven, the data's there. And that's often the thing that will convince people to check it out. And then you try it out. Barbara Fredrickson will say that. In fact, I often say a lot of the positive psychology leaders are not naturally optimists and motivators. Marty Seligman, Chris Peterson, Barbara Fredrickson, a lot of them are kind of grumpy. And they didn't get into this field because they were effervescent and bubbly, and they have been convinced by their own data that this is of value.
Thanks for reminding me, Margaret. I have found that occasionally really providing some of the top-end leaders with data really will turn them around. Once I was talking about positive psychology, and the top leaders in a company looked like they were slipping into a coma. And so I suddenly just tasered them with some of Lasada's results of the 3-to-1 ratio, that the inquiry and advocacy should be 50-50, and this, sort of the self-orientation versus other orientation should be 50-50. They whipped out their pens. They all brightened up, and then we were able to go back into some of the other work. So people knowing some of the data, not just giving the papers, but getting the data inside the fiber can really help you when you're working with data-driven leaders. So Margaret, do we have to say goodbye now?
I think it's time. We're past the time, and we enjoyed talking about positivity. It's a wonderful topic. We appreciate all your questions. Feel free to email more, and we do have our social networking groups. That's a good place to put out questions for all of us to benefit from the answers. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Carol. And thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, and I hope to see some of you at the Coaching in Leadership and Healthcare Conference in September, the 12th and the 13th. And if you're there, come up to us and say hi. So, bye, guys. As we say, we had fun, and now we're done.